We have a very interesting panel for you today. I'm going to set up a little bit of the discussion that we're going to have, and I'll remind you, most of you have been here for the week, so you know the pattern. We will talk about the issues at hand, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions and have a dialogue with the panel. So we are talking about global trends, and we're really looking in line with the Aspen theme of 2024, looking out over the next decades. And how are global trends likely to develop and affect us all? We used as our starting point the Global Trends document that the National Intelligence Council put out about a year ago that talked about 4 predominant trends, they call them megatrends, that are going to be significant factors in how the world evolves over the next decade. They determined that these megatrends were really along the lines of accelerated individual empowerment, diffused power among and within countries, novel and diverging demographic patterns, and growing natural resource demand. Now, those are pretty weighty topics for 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. So we'll try not to dive too deeply into any one of them, but they do offer a lot of food for thought for this panel. And I think you'll see that they are extraordinarily well prepared to talk about these issues and others as well. We have with us today an American diplomat who came up through the ranks of the Foreign Service and for the last quarter century has really helped shape international relations and continues to do so today through training the next generation of Foreign Service officers. We also have the president of a global company with deep American roots who really operates all over the world, a $66 billion company. And I think any one of us would like to have the sort of brand recognition that PepsiCo has in literally every country in the world. And if there's swag associated with this panel today, I just want to make the point that Frito-Lay is my favorite, Zane.
We appreciate that.
We also have the CEO of another company that has been instrumental for decades in shaping the way people buy and how companies think about their clientele. And increasingly and globally, this company has really identified the trends and the standards for how people will buy in the future and has helped companies shape their message and really shape the way they grow. We also have with us today a woman who has been really on the forefront of identifying trends in Muslim countries and in Muslim thinking, starting with her time at the Gallup organization, where she was deeply involved in analysis of the Billion Muslim poll and in a landmark book that she co-authored that really gave voice to the Muslim population globally. So I think you'll really be interested in what these leaders, both business leaders as well as government leaders, have to say about these megatrends this morning. So with that as sort of the setup, we'd like to get into questions and start talking about these trends in the way that they affect all of us. And of course, one of the big trends when you talk about individual empowerment is really how technology and mass communications, global communications, is affecting societies around the world in fundamental ways that we never anticipated. And Nick, I'm going to start with you to talk to us about how you see the effects of that individual empowerment on how nation states are going to be able to negotiate and form alliances in the future. Can you lead us off?
I'd be happy to. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back in Aspen, especially with this distinguished panel. I would recommend the Global Trends Report. If you haven't read it, you can Google it. It's one of the best, I think, objective, very honest, very straightforward assessments. Where is power shifting? Individual power, technological power, nation-state power, which is what I'm the diplomat that Joan introduced, former diplomat. And I guess I'd say, Joan, a couple of big trends underway that we're watching right now. One is we're seeing a major transfer of power, military power, economic, political power, if you will, from the Mediterranean, European world to the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Western Pacific. I'm interviewing Robert Kaplan today at the Aquiline Hotel at noon. He wrote a great book called Monsoon, and he basically said in that book, the key takeaway, think of the last 400 years as being dominated by the Europeans. and think of the next 100, 200 years being dominated by the countries that live in Asia. And he talks about the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific as being the locus of power in the future, the way that the Mediterranean world was, you know, since the Portuguese, Spanish, French, British empires ruled the world for so much of that time period. So more than half the container traffic in the world is shipped from East Africa and the Persian Gulf through the Arabian Sea, through the subcontinent, to the big markets in East Asia. More than half the world's energy. The greatest military powers in the future are going to be in that region: China, India, Japan, Indonesia, the United States. We are very much a Pacific power. That's a big trend that is affecting the world that I used to live in as a diplomat. Two more quickly. One would be the United States. We are shifting in the way that we think about the power and the way that we act in the world. And I think we're at a really important moment in our history. We're still the strongest country in the world. By any objective measure, at the Kennedy School where I teach, we measure power. Political power, what influence do you have to affect the world? Economic power, what's your weight? What is your corporate weight in the world? Military power, of course you know what that is. And soft power, the attractiveness of your culture. We are still, by a long mile, the most powerful country in the world across all four of those metrics in absolute terms. But in relative terms, our power is shifting. And we have a smaller share of the global power. We used to have 50% of the world's GDP in 1950. We no longer have that. So a big story of our time is with the United States. Are we going to choose to lead in the future? Will we have the will to lead? Are we going to sink back into isolationism? You see that now in the left wing of the Democratic Party. You definitely see it in the right wing of the Republican Party. I don't want to offend anybody here. In the Tea Party, so I've been an equal opportunity critic of both parties. And we need to decide, will we continue to play the role that we've played for 70 years since the middle part of the Second World War as the predominant power in the world? So that's one other shift. Where are the Americans heading? Third shift, and I'll finish on this, is certainly in my world, and I teach diplomacy and international politics now, I used to practice it, non-state actors are playing a much bigger role than they did, I know, Joan, you saw this in your career, than they did in the past. So a non-virtuous non-state actor, Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, or ISIS, this group that just proclaimed on Sunday a caliphate in northern Syria, western and central Iraq. I'd say those are non-virtuous, disruptive actors that need to be contained or defeated. But then you have virtuous non-state actors. You have our multinational companies that are doing great things around the world to knit the world together. You have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation trying to eradicate malaria and polio. And so it's not just, I think we tend to focus on the dark side of globalization, but there's a bright side to globalization. And I think that's another shift. Those non-state actors are taking up much more space economically, politically in the international system.
That's a great setup for us. Mitch, did you want to add something to that,
Can I just add
please?
a comment? There are two ways that we think about this at Nielsen, where I'm from. One is in the context of globalization. I think historically, we've tended to think of globalization as about being about movement from west to east, but I think increasingly now we're seeing it being just as much about movement from east to west. We see these large companies that are strong in their local countries, in China and India, that are now starting to play a very important role at a regional or a global level. And I think that actually will have benefits back to the West. It won't be just about a diminished role and diminished influence for the companies based in the West. There'll also be benefits to them from that. The second thing that we point to a lot at Nielsen about the movement of power is, the way we talk about it is power moving from the center, so within companies, I would sit at the center as the CEO, power increasingly moving to the edge. And in fact, we're trying to proactively make that happen within our company, but we're doing that because we sense that's the right direction to go anyway. And so why not encourage it? Why not enable it to speed it up? We think that helps companies be more responsive to the markets that they serve, help them to be more agile, more entrepreneurial, more innovative. And I think we're seeing that same mindset in a lot of companies around the world.
Well, Zane, let's shift to you and talk about from PepsiCo's perspective. How do you see the complexity, the connectivity, the shifts occurring?
Well, I think PepsiCo's perspective on this is that there's never been a time that it's more important for public-private partnerships to address the challenges that these trends bring. And one of the reasons for that is that unlike sovereign states, companies, global companies, have to operate beyond the boundary of the country. And the challenges that these trends pose are not contained within a geographic state. You know, you can't address food scarcity simply and purely within a sovereign state. You have to address it as part of a global ecosystem. Technology, aging populations, and the shift in where the sources and supply of labor and work are going to come from. So we think that, you know, companies that operate clearly across many geographic boundaries are going to be a crucial part of the solution to this. I think the other thing that is, you know, building on what Mitch said about this flow is that it's also not a situation where it's companies rooted either in the East or the West. You know, that probably was the paradigm. But if you look at it today, you've got companies like Alibaba in China who are going to start up operations in the West, as well as many of the Western companies now looking increasingly like Eastern companies. You know, one of the things that sort of guided me throughout my career is you want to be global in nature, but you really do want to be local in substance. So increasingly, companies don't have a national identity, but are much more about how do you operate across geographic boundaries and how do you find systemic solutions to these trends. I think the other thing that is increasingly the case is that the level of cooperations between companies, you know, is really very much on the rise to try and find solutions to the challenges posed by these trends. Companies that compete incredibly aggressively on a day-to-day basis, but do understand that things like environmental impact, how is technology really going to be used as a force for good, is generating much more cooperation in interesting places.
It's an interesting, PepsiCo I think is around 66 billion. I think you're something like the 42nd or 43rd largest country in the world. I mean, you have the same issues and challenges that nation states are dealing with, but you're operating globally. It's
well, absolutely.
fascinating.
I mean, you touched on that we are a company very much our heritage and traditions are rooted in the US, but as we look forward, most of the growth prospect is actually going to come out of the East. And so we're in a wonderful position to actually start blending the best of both worlds. And bringing, you know, the power of your operation as you go into these developing and emerging markets, I think has an incredibly strong amplifying effect on things like improving governance, broadening economic participation, because at the end of the day, when all of our operations are set up locally, we employ thousands of people locally, and one of the biggest impacts you can have in improving governance and improving social stability in any country is in improving participation in the economic wealth of that country. You know, the global companies, I think, are very, very well placed to do that.
Yeah, one of the things that the NIC does in the Global Trends Report, excuse me, which I think is extremely positive, is they take a balanced view. They talk about the negatives, which those of us in the intelligence business, that's a professional liability. We rarely ever warn that peace is breaking out. But they also provide a perspective that says that there's a lot of positives that are on the horizon if we can capitalize on them. The growing middle class and the growing prosperity globally is obviously a positive. The potential for being able to develop energy sufficiency in many countries in the world, that's a positive. And yet, between now and then, we have a lot of challenges to work through. Nick, you mentioned the current situation in the Middle East. And Dahlia, I'd be interested in your perspective on this. We had the Arab awakening, which had a lot of promise associated with it. But today, it's hard to see many positives in the situations in the Middle East. Egypt survived, but is fragile. Saudi succession is even further away than it's ever been in certainly my professional lifetime. You've got the prospect of an Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and you've got Israel and Iran who are watching all of this and trying to figure out our play. How do we think about a way forward for the Middle East? And you've got about 47 seconds to answer that question. Take all the time you want.
That's all I need. Well, first, thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I think we have to always keep in mind that trends are not going to be linear. So there are always going to be competing trends within any dynamic. And like everyone else, I watched the Arab Spring with incredible hope and thought, aha, finally, the Arab world will catch up and will join the rest of the world in bringing about more democratic governments. And then I was disheartened with the way things came to be as we saw Egypt and Syria and other countries seem to fall into chaos more than constructive democracies. So I think that the main trend that we need to understand in the Middle East that brought about the Arab Spring, and I believe will bring about another awakening in the future very soon, is this youth bulge, is this very significant demographic reality in the Arab world. And these young people have a completely different paradigm about their lives than their parents. They are irreverent, they are empowered by technology, they are interconnected, and they just aren't afraid anymore. Now, these young people have been, it seems that spirit that we saw in Tahrir Square has been broken by the events of last summer. But I would caution anyone from believing that what is happening today is going to bring about long-term stability. It just does not make sense empirically. The trends that brought about the first revolution are just as strong now, if not more pronounced. And I think that we should expect those trends and expect those dynamics to bring about even more upheaval in the future unless we push for very substantial fundamental reform.
You raise, I mean, it was fascinating listening to you describe the change in youth. And, you know, you're left thinking, is that, of course, a case for optimism because of that dynamic, or is it a case for extreme concern? Because clearly as people get access, it's both. and it is both. And yet you see that the way we try and address these issues is so much of treating the symptom.
Right.
You know, a top-down push around what we want, rather than just saying, well, what we need to do is to create employment. Mm-hmm. You know, I've seen very few people who have the hope of a much brighter future doing something desperate today. Mm-hmm. And so again, you know, this is one of these things where how do you broaden participation in the economic reality? Another thought, you know, that struck me is when you look at African states, and we always talk about governance being an extreme challenge there, which of course it is. One of the things that correlates between good governance and bad governance in the Arab states is participation in the economic wealth of the country. The mineral wealthy African states struggle. The agricultural-based African states tend to fare better. And again, you know, as we think about technology, how do you make sure that technology is a force for good in the Middle East, because we're allowing to essentially take work there, versus a force for bad, which is some of the actors that you were talking about who use technology in a very different way.
So some of us talked separately about the fact that the last century might have been the century of national security. This century may be the century of global economic security, that may be the predominant driving factor. How do we do exactly, as you're saying, lift all boats in terms of economic prosperity? Nick, is the U.S. prepared to play a leading role in that sort of environment in the future?
I hope so. The reason I say I hope so, because I think we are at this moment where we've got to decide, will we continue to be the world leader or not? There is an international system out there. Professor John Eichenberry at Princeton says there's an international system and we're the system operator. And I think what we've seen certainly in the last couple of years with the Great Recession, the two wars, the American people obviously want to turn back inward. But if we do that, if we don't play this lead economic coordinating role, as well as the war and peace role, putting out the fires around the world, we have to, there's no one else who can take our place. So a lot of people are concerned. We went from the bipolar world of the Cold War between the late 40s and the early 90s. Then we had that unipolar moment, the Clinton presidency, when the United States had much of the world's power. Are we heading towards apolarity? Will there be no state that can balance other states to do the things that you have to do, both positive and negative, to keep the world moving forward? And I do think the economic dimension is the most important. One good change that we've seen is that the economic powers of the 70s and 80s, think of Henry Kissinger. He organized the G7 and said, these are the most powerful economies in the world. We'll make all the macroeconomic decisions. Who was that? That was Canada, the United States, Europe, and Japan. And to his credit, in the waning months of George W. Bush's presidency, when we got hit with that big recession in the autumn of 2008, somebody said, I think it was the French president, bring the G7 together. He said, the G7 in 2008, we need to have China at the table, India at the table, Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Indonesia. And that virtuous G20 is formed, but it's not yet really doesn't have an executive arm. So I think we're beginning to look at power flattening out on the nation-state basis. More power to the middle powers in the world. I named some of them. Mexico is a rising power. Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, rising powers. They need to be included in the system because this system has a backbone, has a skeletal structure to it. But I do think the role of the United States, I think for the foreseeable future, many decades, will continue to be the most active coordinating role.
But I do think leadership can come not just from the biggest countries. In fact, sometimes it comes from the smallest countries. Look at what Lee Kuan Yew did in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, but also his influence on China, going back several decades. And now, with some hope, I would say, you see some of the same kinds of things happening in Africa. From Rwanda, with Paul Kagame there, who's done a remarkable job, improving a lot of life for people in that country, setting an example for the nations around Rwanda and in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think we'll see other examples of leadership just like that. So it doesn't have to just come from the largest countries.
Yeah. I was struck when Nick was talking initially, though, about the movement of goods and services, and particularly the transit lanes that have to be protected and opened. That is a huge challenge for nations. And there have only been a few in the history of the world that have been able to achieve successfully keeping those transit lanes open. It's hard for me to think about how that's going to work in a multipolar world. It really leads you to new alliances and sharing responsibility for that. And it gets right back to some of the global business imperatives that we have, because we have to be able to move those goods and services. We've also talked about the demographics effect already. We've started talking about this. That's where I think the report points out some of the biggest changes are going to occur over the next decade. The move to the cities. Most countries were built around agrarian and rural populations, and they're moving at a rapid pace to the cities, which means there's going to be challenges with resources and supporting those cities. And then Dahlia talked about the youth bulge. We also have at the other end graying populations. The good news about that, in addition to the fact that it affects me and others in this audience, is that graying populations don't go to war as often. I mean, there's a reality of life that the changing demographics are going to affect as we think about the next decade. I want to bring this back to a business perspective for just a moment. And Mitch, I know you and Nielsen have done a lot of work around demographics. How do you see the dramatically changing demographics over the next decade affecting both nations but also business going forward?
Well, it'll be huge. It's this long-term, persistent tailwind on these key parts of the world. By 2040, so beyond 2024, but by 2040, 80% of the world's population will be in Africa or Asia. It's just a massive long-term tailwind. We'll see the rise of the middle class. It'll more than quadruple, going from about 700 million just in Asia right now to about 3 billion over the next couple of decades. And then urbanization that you mentioned. I lived in China for a number of years, and the human migration in China from the countryside, from the rural areas to cities happens at an unbelievable pace. There'll be another 100 million people urbanized in China in just the next decade. By 2025, the McKinsey Global Institute said that the top 600 cities in the world will account for 50% of the world's GDP, which is quite a bit higher than what it is today. And so these are future-shaping trends, and there's nothing that will stop them. They're just huge forces out there, and so businesses that can position themselves to enable these trends to happen productively and positively, and also to take advantage of the tailwind that they represent, that's going to make all the difference, I think, in markets all over the world.
Zane, I've heard you talk about China as a factor in global business. Share with us how you're thinking about it.
Well, China obviously is going to be a massive proportion of global growth going forward. You know, if you're in the consumer goods business, you know, we can debate whether it's 20% or 30%, but it's somewhere in that bracket of future growth, which is just a staggering statistic in its own right. So clearly, how you gear up in terms of talent, your brands, your product development, and your engagement with China is crucial. It's crucial both in terms of preparing yourself to do business there, but it's also really important in terms of making sure that China itself is integrating the right way. I think the other thing, though, that as you look at some of this growth shift is, and it's coming back to the point you raised about things like urbanization. I think two things, you know, we need to think about, okay, what are the consequences for that on the environment and how are we going to handle that? There's some great panels at Aspen talking about the city of the future and how is this going to be accommodated. But equally, how do we do things that actually slow it down a little bit as well? Because, you know, one of the things that we're engaged in is things like a sustainable farming initiative, which is trying to get many, many small-scale farmers, get their productivity rates up, getting them much more engaged and integrated in the supply chains. It's a great business proposition for us because at the end of the day, we're a company that is very, you know, we have Pepsi on the name, but we're more an agro company than we are a beverage company. Over 50% of our business is foods. And so actually building out supply chains in foods and integrating small-scale farmers into the food chain is crucial. Another big argument for doing that as well is it's not just to, again, broaden the bottom of the pyramid and encourage greater participation and less urbanization, but also as populations age, a lot of the products and the nutritional profile of the products that's needed are likely to come out of things that small-scale farming is better suited towards. And you see those trends even in the Western world with significant growth of organic products. And so there is a place for this type of farming as well. And I think the final thing I'd really raise on this is that, you know, people tend to think again about, you know, the flows as being non-linear or as about being one country versus another. Increasingly, as a global company, you're thinking about this simply as a portfolio of opportunities. You know, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, they all need to play, and we need to make all of them work for our business to work. So it's not about one versus the other. It's about how do you find systemic solutions that has the whole work, which is back to your point about all the boats rising. And again, why I think global companies very, very well positioned to partner with governments because we bring this quite different perspective.
That's an interesting thought, and I know Nielsen has done some work around the way product and distribution used to be developed and worked was that you would market to individuals and you'd try to figure out how the individuals wanted to buy and market to them, and your production and your distribution was centered around that. Now with global connectivity, when you market to an individual, you're marketing to masses at the same time because they're connected to others. So that really plays into well what Zane is talking about, I think.
I think the continued rise of global, well, I should say mobile communication, mobile technology, and then that coupled with hyperconnectivity are going to change the game entirely. And you see it right now, sort of an early version of the future when you look at e-commerce platforms. And while for most consumer goods, they still represent a relatively small percent of total sales, I think they do represent the future of what the world's going to look like, where on an e-commerce platform, somebody can purchase, they can also consume media, they can be exposed to advertising. It's all digital and almost all happens in real time. And more and more of the world will look that way. In China with Alibaba, with their Taobao and Tmall platforms, their Alipay platform for payment, you know, that company alone in China is already bigger than Amazon, eBay, and PayPal combined. And it, by the way, doesn't even dominate the market necessarily in China because Tencent's a pretty serious player in that market too. It's really going to be amazing, I think. I think we're going to have a lot of surprises that will emerge from the combination of hyperconnectivity and ubiquitous mobile devices in the hands of consumers. And it'll be exciting to just sit and and try to imagine all the good things that are going to happen. There'll be some concerning things too, which generally relate to privacy, which generally relate to what control consumers have over their personal information. The more that companies, though, in the marketplace treat personal information of consumers as a currency that those consumers can choose to trade or not in exchange for some benefit, I think the better the markets will develop over time. That'll probably mean it's a little bit slower to develop, a little bit less efficient, but it'll develop in a much more positive and durable way over time. So these are some of the really exciting things I think that are out in front of us.
Dahlia?
I think that one thing we also have to understand about this hyperconnectivity that is the concerning, or the sort of the dark side of that, is its effect on societies and their polarization. So when you look at trends around the world, what I see is greater and greater polarization. You see extreme versions of that in a place like Syria, and you see milder versions in a place like the United States. But around the world, people are becoming less and less cohesive and more polarized. Now, I don't believe the answer to polarization is conformity or what is called national unity in some places. I think the answer is pluralism, or what Seth Kaplan calls forming a social covenant. And I think what we do is, especially in emerging markets and especially in developing countries, is rush too quickly to nation building without spending enough time on society forming. So a place like Afghanistan or a place like Iraq, we didn't spend enough time. A place like Egypt, there wasn't enough time spent or enough energy spent on this social covenant. People coming together and deciding together how they want to run their societies, their non-negotiables, the principles that they want to build their countries on. And then they can disagree about everything else and have a constructive framework in which to do that. But when we don't do that homework, and technology makes it even worse. That's the issue with polarization, is if you find enough people out there, because we're all so interconnected, that agree with you, your potentially very extreme point of view feels a lot more rational, right? So we do have to manage the polarizing and the fragmentation that hyperconnectivity can create.
Nick, how do we do that?
Well, I think this is a fascinating theme that my three colleagues here have talked about. And in the dimension of international politics, we tend to think of great power rivalries as very competitive over resources or nationalism or ideology. But the 21st century, I think all of us are saying this, it demands a different mindset. It demands that we think of ourselves as integrated, that there's 7.5 billion of us all living on one planet, and that we need to struggle together against climate change, trafficking of human beings, crime and drug cartels. And so the virtuous possibility is that China and the United States and India and Saudi Arabia and Mexico and Brazil and all the other countries in between are going to have to coalesce to overcome those challenges. And that's the dark side of globalization. And we can do the good things. I mean, massive inroads on global poverty have been made in the last 30 years by China, India, and Brazil. Great advances in public health because of the UN, the US government, national governments, the Gates Foundation. And I think that one of the themes of our century, this century, our kids' world, is going to be, can we actually knit countries together in common cause? It's a much different way of looking at the international sphere. We've traditionally thought of competition, but collaboration is a very important way of looking at politics.
Wonderful point, Nick, because if you just take one thing in the trend, scarcity of resources and food, and just how desperately concerning, and it's not just food, but it's nutritious food. Yeah, we can probably produce enough wheat and corn, but that's not going to create a great diet. And you've got this interesting triangle, haven't you? Wonderful technology in the US, a desperate need in China, and 60% of the world's arable lands that haven't been cultivated in Africa. Those three things are absolutely joined at the hip. Yeah. And if you're going to, whereas at the moment, nobody's really treating Africa strategically. I mean, the Chinese are in there, probably the most strategic, but they're in there with peasant farmers who are trying to help and build, which is good, and I would support 100%. But there is an opportunity for much, much greater collaboration on the global stage.
Yeah, I agree. The idea of companies collaborating who otherwise would compete, and countries collaborating who otherwise would compete, if everybody looks at every situation as zero-sum, then we're not going to get to where we need to go.
Right.
Robert Wright, I think, said it well, that cooperation has been the key to most major steps forward in human progress over the long arc of history. In his book, Non-Zero, more than a decade ago, I think it's still just as valid and just as true today. This whole non-zero sum thinking, how important it is to the markets that we operate in and to society as a whole.
I think it's extraordinary that we've coalesced around this idea of cooperation and alliances globally for the future that would really improve life across the globe. I want to turn it over to the audience now for questions on any of these topics that we've raised, assuming that you're all sufficiently caffeinated. We have a hand up. I actually can't see very well, so I'm gonna ask the people with the microphones to take charge.
Thank you very much to the panel. I think this is incredibly interesting and of value. My name is Tom Connolly. I'm one of the global leaders at Ernst & Young, which we now call EY. And my question to you, and it's a bit of a comment as well as a question. I haven't heard today any discussions around the oceans. And if I look at history, the power of the British Empire and the power of the United States very much has been impacted by our reach in terms of the oceans and controlling trade or protecting trade that takes place across the oceans. With the tension that exists between China, Japan, Vietnam, in terms of oceans and in terms of building navies, can you comment on the need, if you will, for cooperation between the US and China and the region in Asia in regards to the oceans and trade and the navies?
Nick, you want to?
Boy, is that a great, we could organize an entire course around that question. That's a really good question. And again, I'm going to advertise my friend Robert Kaplan. I'm just going to interview. He's going to speak at noon today. He has written 3 books about your question in the last 4 years. He wrote Monsoon, saying Indian Ocean will replace the Mediterranean as the great power center, economic, political. He wrote a book called The Return of Geography, and he made your point. He said, we're beginning to see nation states invest a lot more in their navies because these are the highways of the world. The transit commercial highways are the oceans. And he wrote his book on the South China Sea, talking about the divisive aspects. So just 2 quick points. One is we're now seeing naval competition in the world, and the place where it's most acute is the South and East China Sea. In the Paracel and Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, there are 6 different countries who say, we own these islands and we own the mineral resources beneath them, the oil and gas beneath them. China is pushing out, really, I must say, objectively, without any foundation in international law, to claim territory. They sank a Vietnamese fishing trawler 3 weeks ago. They've been harassing the Philippines at Scarborough Shoal because China's in search of energy, in search of resources, and in search of building out historic China. So that's the divisive part of it. It's also happening up in the East China Sea, where the big competition between Japan and China over the Senkaku, or the Diaoyu Islands, as the Chinese call them. So that's the competitive part. But there's a virtuous collaborative part, to bring us back to, I think, the 5 of us have been saying, and that is, if you think about the need to transport oil and gas, to transport containers, actually to transport people by the seas, you do need countries to collaborate to keep the choke points open. Think of the Strait of Hormuz as a choke point. Energy needs to get out. It needs to transit the Arabian Sea, right, and the Bay of Bengal to get to the big economies of Asia. There's another choke point in the east. I wish we had a map. The Strait of Malacca. And so the US Navy, for the last 60 years, has been keeping these straits open for everybody. And one way to look at China's economic rise is it's been built on the back of the service provided by the US Navy to keep the channels of communication, the highways of the world on the oceans open. That's where we get into collaboration. It's in China's interest that the US Navy stay in the East Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. They don't really want us to leave, but they want to collaborate in a different way with us. So I think we can look at this, your question, both, there's a negative part of it, but there's also a very positive part.
Wonderful. This gentleman back here.
I wanted to pick up on the theme that Dahlia mentioned about polarization. And increasingly there's polarization between the Shia and Shiite communities. How does that play out? How does that get resolved? There seems to be a higher likelihood of more fragmentation. Are we going to see new countries emerge, you know, in where Iraq used to be?
Well, I'm definitely not going to venture a guess, but I think that there needs to be incentive to unite and to put down arms and to come together and form a cohesive community. If you look at other places where that's happened, there's always been an incentive for people to come together. So I think of Ireland as an example. After hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict, it was an economic boom that brought people together and made them, you know, create a robust peace. So it's not an easy thing, but polarization also is not inevitable. I'm not of the school of thought that Sunnis and Shias are destined to kill each other and that's just the way they are, because they didn't always behave this way. And it's not simply because they were living under, you know, an iron fist. There's been long histories of coexistence among these groups. So the answer is very complicated. I don't know the whole answer. I don't think it's inevitable, and I think that we can create incentives for people to stop the fighting.
Back here we have.
Thanks. Thanks for all your comments. I want to build on that in creating incentives economically. One thing I don't believe you commented on, at least as far as I'm concerned, and by the way, I'm Shelley Porgas, Washington, D.C., former director of the Global Entrepreneurship Program at the State Department, is the new models of innovation and entrepreneurship that are going on all over the world to, in fact, engage those young people that Dahlia talked about. What have you seen in your work across the world in terms of what are the models that are working to engage young people? Because that's exactly it. Young people could be the greatest opportunity and advantage we have in building a great world. Or they, in fact, as we're seeing, as they're getting recruited to some of these militia, you know, they could, in fact, go the other way. So what are some of the models that you're seeing to engage them and to create incentives for them to engage productively in their economies and their societies?
Anyone?
I could, I mean, a number of things. I mean, investment, I mean, is crucially important. Building grassroots type businesses. And this, back on that, doing this with this theme of collaboration. I mean, one of the thoughts that struck me as we talk about collaboration is a little while ago we announced a major investment in Egypt. And, you know, challenging thing to do in the current environment. So that was pretty impressive. The thing, though, that was, I thought, even more impressive is that when our competitor announced an investment a week later, we were actually pleased. And that rarely happens between Pepsi and Coke, trust me. Very rarely happens.
It never happens.
But the notion of another 1,000 jobs being created, more people back off the streets with less idle times, and the hope of prosperity and the future is clearly, okay, it's going to give us a headache within the industry, but it's going to give us an incredible tailwind in terms of stability and in creating an expanded consumer base and customer base within the country. I think the other thing is that technology can be used for much more good, and there should be a social dimension to it that doesn't just say, you know, how do we take technology just purely simply to the lowest cost service provider in terms of us, but how do we put a social dimension around it? Because we can build technology hubs in a lot of these countries, engage a lot of youth, and we're starting to look at models like that from our existing business bases in some of these more troubled spots, because there you can export the work rather than move the labor.
I think another really good model is partnerships between educational institutions and industry. Because one of the biggest issues in the Arab world is lots and lots of university graduates without real workable skills. And so there's this huge gap of people graduating but are simply unemployable from the perspective of industry. And industry for a long time has just simply complained about it rather than partnered with educational institutions, which will take time to change, but if we can create those real life projects for students to work on right away, I think that'll solve a big part of the problem.
I've seen a few signs for encouragement. I guess with the way financing, access to capital has been facilitated and also lowering barriers. Access to capital, things like microfinance and crowdsourcing for capital, lowering barriers. Even in old Europe, I saw some examples recently when I was in Italy of them creating much easier access to capital and then relieving them of some of the normal regulations and requirements so that entrepreneurial activity could more likely flourish. Very encouraging, and they're getting good results from it in the early stages there.
We had one other person in front of Shelley, this gentleman, and I think this will be our last question.
Anyone on the panel could address this. Daryl Burton, Phoenix, Arizona. It seems for a while that English was the international language of business, and I'm wondering with this increased, faster growth in the East, whether English will continue to be the international language of business.
Nick?
I can't speak from the business perspective, but from the diplomatic perspective, you all know that we've had lots of lingua franca. Greek, several thousands of years ago, was the language of diplomacy. French, 18th, 19th, into the 20th century. English has become the language in which people negotiate. When I used to negotiate with the Chinese, their absolutely fluent English speakers appeared across the table from me, and they had the self-confidence to negotiate documents in the English language. English has completely dominated the discourse in international politics. And what's happening is that several 100 million Chinese are learning English.
The biggest for-profit education business in China is English, English training. And they will soon have more English speakers, if they don't already, than North America.
But I would say it's incumbent upon us to tell our kids and grandchildren it's a sign of respect to learn someone else's language if you're an English speaker, a native English speaker. And it also makes sense, I think, from a business and political point of view, to be able to relate to somebody in their own language.
I think that's a great point. I think that the critical things are actually go way beyond language. It's cultural understanding, it's affinity, it's the ability to see some things from other people's perspective. These are going to be much more important than the technical issue of which language do we communicate in.
Wonderful. Last question to the panel. What's your greatest hope for the future? Where do you see, when you look through an optimistic lens, what do you see for 2024? Nick, we'll start with you since we started with you at the offset.
Is this the 30-second lightning round?
This is the 30-second lightning round.
Just so I know mine. My hope, because we want to look ahead this year at Aspen, is that the United States and China will never fight each other. We're going to be the strongest countries in the world for the next century, and we've got to coalesce. We've got to meet each other halfway, and we've got to collaborate. We're going to compete, and the dichotomy will be China's most important partner and most important competitor for military power. And yet, we've got to accentuate the collaboration, because think of these global challenges. We've all been talking about them, from climate change to trafficking to poverty. Our two countries can do enormous good in the world if we meet together, integrate, work together, and create a virtuous circle of nations collaborating. So I think that's my greatest hope.
Fabulous. Mitch?
Population growth is unstoppable. It's going to grow from 7 billion to 10 billion. It's going to continue to put enormous strain on water, food, energy. But my great hope is that we'll see more great innovations come forward to the world to relieve that stress and strain, just like we saw years ago when Borlaug invented this new strain of wheat that was more disease resistant, much higher yield, and now he's given this phrase that said he probably saved 1 billion people from starvation. I'm optimistic that we'll see more of those kinds of things for the world.
Great. Dahlia?
My greatest hope is actually also my greatest concern, which is a huge group of young people who have very high expectations for their future and are demanding more freedom, more independence, and more opportunity.
And Zane, last word.
My greatest hope is, on the general level, is that we'd have figured out this collaboration model where countries sit opposite each other, much the same way companies work in industry associations. Big companies, small companies gather together to work for the good of the association. There'll be a model like that for sovereign states. And then at the specific is that one of the first issues we would tackle is agriculture, big time. Out of the 7 billion people on this planet, 2 billion work in agriculture. Out of the 2 billion, 1 billion go hungry. And if we're going to address just some of the societal problems that get to this bottom of the pyramid, improve governance, improve participation in the future of this planet, we would make a big change in that area.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a terrific audience. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all.